Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. And on Wednesday night, I went to a debate at the Soho Forum and had an absolute blast. It was Dave Smith taking on Alex Nowrasteh on the subject of immigration. And I decided that I had to get today's guest on. He and I, in the past, we did a show on immigration. He's an absolute legend in libertarian circles. So for libertarians, he probably needs no introduction. But for the rest, I'll give the introduction that he gives on his X page. He's a father, grandfather, lover of liberty, justice, reason, and as you can see, pipe tobacco. Sheldon Richman, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, nice to be back. I think it's my third time, so always a pleasure.
Sheldon, I just want to say this. You, Walter Block, some of the older libertarians that I've had the great pleasure of interacting with, Lawrence Reed, are really a treasure. Gene Epstein, too. The erudition, the desire to learn, to read, to understand. In talking with Stephan Kinsella, he told me that today's libertarians, the young guys, they don't even read, he said. Now, I don't know how true it is, but I know of the older generation. Even when I disagree, they're still putting forth solid arguments. So just before we even get anywhere, just thank you for that. And thank you for, what a kind guy you are. You're really a really nice guy. Yeah. So Dave Smith, the proposition was libertarians should favor closed borders, even for people who are peaceful and healthy. That was, I might have it off a little bit, but that was the gist of it. So Dave favors closed borders. Alex is opposed to him. So give us a summary of Dave's position, why he's for.
Yeah, the resolution was something like, I was a little surprised when I first read the resolution at the Soho Forum site. And I know Gene is very careful. Both agree. Both of the guests agree, because obviously, if you're going to ask him to defend the yes or defend the no, some people are going to say, well, no, I don't want to defend that, or no, I don't want to say no to that. So they probably go through some negotiation and word change to come up with a resolution. I'm sure Gene puts a lot of thought into it, and it's in collaboration with the guests. So it was something like immigration restrictions for the peaceful and healthy. So it did limit that. Are sensible in America today. I think that's pretty close to verbatim. That may be off one a word or so, but that's certainly the letter and definitely the spirit. So in other words, it didn't need to get into the debate about what do you do about a guy who's got a criminal record, or what do you do about somebody with tuberculosis. We've taken that off the table, right? So Dave's whole thing seemed to be, first of all, right out of the gate, he said something like, Dave Smith said, this is all about voluntarism. So I'm thinking, wow, that's really where he's going to go. This is all about voluntarism, because I didn't see how he could hold up his side, as Alex pointed out many times during the debate. But that's the whole thing. And the idea was the American people, at the same time he's saying he's not endorsing democracy or majority rule. I mean, he did say that explicitly, but implicitly he is adopting it, because he's saying, look, the American people, if, and again, he's vague, large numbers of immigrants come in against the will of the people, then that's not voluntarism. That's pretty close to verbatim. In his opening paragraph of his statement, he made it very clear. He even said something like, "I'm not saying the people own the land, that the government typically now controls." He kind of backed away from that. I think that was a previous claim he used to make. That
he kind of made it here too, though.
Yeah, there was a lot of mud in this. His presentation, I have to say. I didn't expect much from him because I knew what his case was, but I was wondering, okay, let's see if he's going to say something I hadn't thought of before. That's always possible. I know you approach things that way. You want to learn. I didn't hear it. I did not hear it. In fact, I was more appalled than I expected to be, because there was really a message of what I call national collectivism. That's what it was. National collectivism. And, in the past, and we did a show on this, I've written 3 articles. One is a longish blog post, but 3 articles that addressed his various arguments. Now, I didn't ever name him. I tend to, keep things from being personal. So I just dealt with the arguments about public property, static analysis. In other words, they act like all that would change under our policy, a libertarian policy, would be you would take the gates off the border. And I argue, libertarians don't typically argue that way. If you change that one thing, you're now legalizing a whole bunch of other things. Entrepreneurship to find people jobs and apartments. You get a whole industry or set of industries. So that's the static analysis. And then also the business about public property and how the government has preempted homesteading. And a lot of immigrants would have homesteaded and would be homesteading today if the government suddenly opened up its, got rid of all the land it holds. It just kind of opened it up to homesteading. And if we had open borders. So I've never seen him refer to any of that. Now, maybe he doesn't read the Libertarian Institute where my articles are posted, except that is run by Scott Horton, who's his good buddy, who he cited in the debate at one time. But I've never seen him answer that. I don't mean he's got to name me. I'm not looking for the glory of the spotlight. I've never seen him contend with these arguments. And it's clear by his debate opening statement and the whole performance that he's not aware of those arguments, because you don't see any adjustment in his position to try to, in effect, show that I'm wrong. So he was disappointing, and I had, I didn't have any high expectations. I was still disappointed.
So it's funny, I had the opposite effect. He did better than what I thought he would do.
Really?
He did. Well, the thing is, as I'm watching and when I'm listening to the debate, I'm not only listening to what they're saying, but I'm watching the faces of all the participants to see how they're reacting. And one thing that it's crystal clear to me is that Dave is a performer. And I'm not knocking him. I'm not saying what a jerk, he's a performer. I'm saying he's a stand-up comic. He knows how to improv and communicate to an audience. Yeah. And I heard a lot of emotional appeals up there to you're going to change their country into something that's unrecognizable. And your kids are going to be in school with kids that can't speak English and that are have been traumatized. There was a lot of that. And I thought that he didn't come with a script. He, is very quick on his feet. There's no doubt about that. I didn't find his arguments persuasive, mostly because the next day, after listening to his argument is essentially, although he doesn't identify it as such, the Hoppian argument, that given that the public property has been expropriated from all the people, it basically belongs to the people that it was expropriated from, and they get to make the decisions about the property. The argument falls apart on so many levels because now you're just supporting democracy. There's no way around it because you're saying that the majority of the shareholders, in essence, has to control the given area. And for one thing, when you have a stock market or you have a corporation or a joint enterprise, the parties that go into that go in voluntarily, and they decide ahead of time the means by which decisions are going to be made. Is it going to be majority vote, plurality of vote? Does it have to be a supermajority? Whatever, But in this case, nobody gets to decide if we're going to hold to the position, and I think it's relatively accurate, that this land has been stolen. It's financed through tax dollars that are stolen for people. So he said, well, 95% of Americans don't want open borders. Okay, but if everybody owns it, then what about the 5%? How are you just going to violate their rights? How are how is it not a rights violation to say that Joe the plumber can't hire somebody from Mexico to work in his shop? And I went through the implications of this view. Now, one of the arguments is that immigrants are going to be using roads. That's the only way they can get around. Roads are public property. Okay, but roads are financed primarily through gas taxes. So the gas tax is primarily paid by the people in the given state. And a lot of things are financed by the locality. So by that argument, I pointed this out to somebody afterwards. Right now, I'm in New York City. I'm from Connecticut. By the logic of Dave's argument, you could prevent me. I mean, the citizens of New York could vote and say, we don't want people coming here from Connecticut. And I just don't think libertarians would support that. It would also hold then that if the vast majority of people, which they do, don't think heroin should be transported on their highways or on their local roads, well, now the war on drugs is good. It's also the case that in many of these situations, the people that actually are going to be benefiting, quote unquote, from border restrictions, say the people in California where it's state owned, that's going to be financed with federal dollars. So you're saying that those people over there need to be compensated by people in Connecticut. How then do you argue against something like reparations, where it's collective guilt, collective victimization? And I just don't see how libertarians don't see that. And somebody on my X page actually pointed out, yes, Mike, but what you don't understand is that I don't like all those other things, and I do like immigration restrictions. And it's hard for me to see how it's anything but that. I mean, does that make sense, or am I just
and Alex
in
kept
the
pointing
cloud?
that out. Alex Nowrasteh kept saying libertarians don't make these sort of arguments when it comes to anything else, and they name guns and drugs and other stuff. So yeah, there's a glaring inconsistency there, which Smith did not answer. It makes you wonder if this is a solution looking for a problem, and if that's the case, then why did they favor this solution? Why are they in search of the problem for the solution? What is it? And I don't know. I don't know Dave. I never met Dave. I think we've had one or two private message exchanges on Twitter on other issues. So I don't want to say anything about him, but some of the others in this kind of wing of the libertarian movement, I get a bit uneasy feeling about that their view. I mean, Hoppe has said some things that lead you to think. Well, and Dave himself did go into culture quite a bit. It wasn't
Right.
He wasn't giving a predominantly economic argument. And don't forget, I mean, in his analysis, it doesn't matter what kind of intentions are in the heads of the immigrants coming in. They don't have to have bad intentions. He never says something like, "Oh, they're going to vote socialist, and we're going to get socialism." That people make that argument. He never did. Or they're going to vote for the Democrats. It's in general, he made it seem like these people will come in, and and it'll be a lot of people, and they'll change the culture against the will of most people. I don't see how that's a libertarian argument. Before you even get to whether it's right or wrong, I don't see how it's a libertarian argument. Thomas Sowell, who I admire in 100 different ways, but there are a couple areas where I would take vehement, issue with him. He's not good on immigration, and he says, if anybody can come in, America won't be America anymore. That's what Smith was saying throughout his performance. It won't be America anymore. And when Calvin Coolidge signed the 1924 law, that horrible law that limited Eastern and Southern European people from coming, or really cutting back the quotas to like 19th century levels, a fraction of 19th century. He said, America is for Americans. To me, that means you don't understand America.
Right.
You say that. And this is Calvin Coolidge, beloved by some libertarians as the greatest president. Okay, that may be a low bar, of course, but the greatest president ever. I can name some libertarians who think that about him. So I just think this is an issue that runs very deep. And if somebody is taking Smith's position, that says a lot about that person's worldview and philosophy and political philosophy. Because just look at it. The roads. That case, that hypothetical came up in the debate about if the government was going to sell off a shoe factory that it had operated for a very long time, should it sell it only to Americans? And Alex said no, sell it to the highest bidder, and then give the money to the taxpayers. That seems like the right answer. Dave, I think at first was saying no, it ought to go to Americans. But first of all, I reject the whole analogy. We're not selling the roads, and we're deciding to sell the roads to immigrants or Americans. They're just traversing the roads.
Right.
Your point is right too. They're going to be buying gasoline, which means they're going to be contributing under the current system to the maintenance of roads. Now, if we ever privatized everything, the Hoppe and I presume Smith's position is, if all property was private And by the way, this applies even to limited government people, because Ayn Rand said under capitalism, all property is private.
Right.
So I don't know if that means the government has to rent from other people, but that's a different debate between you and me. So assuming all property is private, which Hoppe would favor and Dave Smith would favor, that means the roads are private. And I have a feeling a lot of people would be either building or would have somehow through auction or whatever acquired the government's roads, would have acquired them and want people on them, because they take you from this business to that business to that business.
Yeah.
I'm not talking, they seem to think everything's going to be internal neighborhood roads, little streets inside your development, and we can keep immigrants out. But no, people are going to be operating, long distance roads, and businesses will locate along those roads. And of course, we'll want people traveling by, because that's how you get traffic in both senses, people, customers. I don't understand their case at all. I mean, I kind of understand it, but it doesn't make any sense. I understand it makes no sense, like you're saying.
Right. Well, then there's this idea that if the immigrant is invited or sponsored by a specific person, then the immigrant can come into the country. But I don't see how that solves their issue with the immigrants using roads in that sense, because I live in Connecticut. So if I sponsor a guy from Mexico, he's going to travel through all kinds of roads that I haven't helped pay for, that belong to somebody else. It's just, it's so incoherent to me. Right. That I just can't fathom how people buy it. And then there's this analogy that came up. Well, public property has to be governed somehow. For instance, you don't want a 55-year-old heroin addict stumbling into the girls' bathroom or at a school or some such thing. This is, again, to me, it's just an emotional appeal. As you try to discredit an argument by asserting a conclusion that people are going to find reprehensible, you're going to claim this is the logical end and then say, therefore, the argument is disavowed. But to me, it's nonsensical for a few reasons. One, because a school is designated for a specific purpose. It's for education, right? It's not for heroin addicts to be shooting dope in the bathroom. Roads are designated for a specific purpose, for traveling on. Also, there's no risk to anybody because an immigrant is in a car on the highway. A heroin addict in a school bathroom is a clear threat to people, to these children. So the analogy to me just does not work. And I think, and Alex pointed this out, and this is one of the great lessons that I learned from both von Mises and Ayn Rand, is that control breeds more control. So why aren't we arguing to dial back controls? So if your problem is with public land, well, let's then argue to get rid of public land. Let's not make the argument, well, we have public land, so let's give the government control. We should be making the arguments go in the opposite direction. And I happen to agree with you. This seems to me like it's a viewpoint looking for an argument. It is, to me, very reminiscent of what Friedrich Hayek said about Keynes, that Keynes had a political viewpoint and then constructed an economic theory to support the viewpoint he already had. And like you said, I'm not saying this is what Dave did here, but that's what this seems like to me, is it's a preference that looking for an argument.
Well, because the arguments are, I'm not against in principle having a preferred conclusion or policy and then searching backwards to see if there's a strong argument for it. If you come up with a strong argument for it, that's fine. I'm not really concerned about the direction. That's not what damns it. The point is, he comes up with bad arguments. And they're so obviously weak. Why do you have to wonder, why doesn't he see it? I mean, I almost got the feeling, and I'm sure I was reading this into his expression on his face, how is he not embarrassed to say the national collectivist things he was saying over and over again during that thing? The first article I wrote in response to him, which was called "Immigration in an Nth Best World," I addressed his points about, his view seems to be, if you're against immigration, any kind of immigration restrictions, then you have to be against any rules that the government puts on any land, property, assets that it controls. So in other words, for him, there's no difference between a stop sign and a do not enter sign at the border. And I laid out what I called, I believe I called it the non-disruption principle. Maybe this is original as a libertarian corollary. But it means as long as we're in this nth best world, maybe it's the second, maybe it's further down the list, but it's not the first best world. It's not a totally free society. As long as it's controlling some, and this is entirely dovetails with what you said, as long as the government is controlling roads, schools, name it, other things, then of course the taxpayers, and assuming it's like stuff that's also open to the public, the government also has quote public stuff that's not open to the public. That's another issue, like military bases or something. But talk about the stuff that is open to the public. Then they're taxpayers. So if someone, even an American citizen, comes into, say, a public library, and Rothbard used to talk about this, who's never takes a bath, so he stinks to high hell, and he has to make the case worse, he's got a boom box without earphones like you're wearing, and he sits in the library, they can ask him to leave. That's not giving up any libertarian principle. We would say privatize the library, but while we're awaiting that, since the taxpayers are being forced to fund the library, and will want to use the library, this is kind of a pre-internet, I guess, example, showing my age here. If somebody's actually obstructing regular people, regular taxpayers from using it as as a library is intended to be used, yeah, they can kick that guy out. And the more extreme cases like the Smith case, a pedophile wants to use the girls' bathroom in a school. Now, obviously, no. First of all, there's compulsory attendance. They're taxing you, so your kids are going. They at least have to provide minimal safety to the kids because they've grabbed custody of them.
Yeah,
there's a little bit of choice now, more than there used to be, but that doesn't change it. So it's a bogus argument from Smith and his side that he's giving you an either or, right? If you reject restrictions on immigration, that opens the floodgate. You now have to accept. You now have to take the position that the government cannot in any way put a restriction on any property it controls. That's a BS argument, and the fact that he keeps saying that, I wrote in response to that. I don't notice any assimilation that this has been argued against, but here's why that's wrong. I've never seen him do that. He certainly didn't do it at the Soho debate. It's a nonsense argument, ridiculous, scary argument, like you said. It's set to scare people.
I recently interviewed a psychologist about the illusory truth effect, how when something is repeated over and over again, people tend to believe it that are listening to it. And one of the things Dave did in the debate is he repeatedly said to Alex, you're not addressing my arguments. You're not addressing my arguments. But of course, he did address all his arguments. Okay. And this is something that just, I don't know, it disappoints me. It scares me. Alex comes with hard data, right? He comes with about immigrants paying into the welfare system, about employment, about economic freedom index, personal freedom indexes, crime, all kinds of things that Alex has that he's studied. And in the comments, well, first of all, Dave misrepresented one of the things. He said he said it seems like the only indicator you have is GDP ratio, growth to GDP ratio, or spending to GDP ratio, something like that. And Gene actually interrupted and said, no, actually, I'm familiar with this, and that's not the case. And he went through all the various measures. But nevertheless, Dave says that. Now, in reading through the comments, this is where I really get disappointed. Aside from some of the absolute vile stuff that was directed toward Alex, one person said, once I saw him reading from a script, he lost the debate. And I'm thinking, why? If the point is to get to the truth, then why would it be a knock against him that he came prepared and didn't memorize all these things? Other people were saying, parroting Dave, because Dave says we have to live in reality. But it seems to me that the guy that comes with the empirical evidence is the guy living in reality. He has the empirical studies, all the information right here, but yet he's being chastised as the guy not living in reality.
I didn't notice him relying on any. I mean, it didn't occur to me as I watched it. I didn't see him looking down and reading.
No, he had it with him.
Academics reading lectures, and they hardly.
He wasn't doing that.
You know what pleased me about Alex so much, and I don't know Alex either. We've had email exchanges, and obviously I praised his work, but I don't know him. I never met him. Never even had a private. Well, we've had some emails, so that's private. What I loved about his presentation was it wasn't so data laden, because this is not a data argument. I think you're going to agree with me on this. Sure, he brings it in certainly as a rebuttal. When the other side, talks about problems, he can then say, "Yeah, but we're not seeing those kinds of problems." Okay, that's fine. But notice that isn't the spirit of rebutting something someone else said. His affirmative case happened to be for the negative, but his own case was not a data case. It was about liberty. Individual liberty and a presumption. One point, and this reminds me of a point I have to make, although it's related. Dave, one point said, "There's no presumption that you have a right to be here." And Alex, this came, I think, when they were really in close combat with Gene in between, ducking, I guess. But Alex said, "What do you mean there's no presumption of liberty? You have a right to be here, free to be here. That's why we're libertarians. Presumption of liberty." So no, I was really delighted that Alex didn't make an essentially data-driven case. And so I just thought he did I told him this privately, like, you did a fantastic job.
I thought so too. It's just, but going by the comments, like some people said, "Oh, Alex just asserts things, but he doesn't present any evidence." And I'm thinking, what are you talking about?
Crazy.
It absolutely is.
Thank goodness I don't see these comments.
Just to circle back a little bit to what you talked about, the maintaining the culture. It reminds me of, I'm sure you've read it, Nathaniel Brandon's article, "The Divine Right of Stagnation." And he talked about the idea that the article was about workers, in manufacturing or whatever, who want the government to protect their jobs as if nothing should ever change. And that's what that culture argument sounds like to me. It's like we have a right to maintain things as they are. We never have to adapt to change. We never have to grow. We just can stay locked into this. Oh, and by the way, another one of the implications of this argument that they're making is, how could a libertarian with that view oppose local zoning? Because if I live in a town and the town members have been paying, the taxes, and now I want to sell my property to a guy who's going to come in and develop it into a strip club, but the neighbors all say, no, we don't want a strip club. Well, you'd have to say, well, the majority of the people in the town that pay the taxes don't want it. Yeah. So the other thing.
Can I say,
go ahead.
Say one thing about the culture? It's very important.
Go ahead.
You're right about that. He said, and he got some negative reaction in the audience from this. He said something like, first of all, he talked about someone he talked to once in Texas, I think, who sends his kids to a school that he attended, whose father attended, whose grandfather attended, whose great brother, all the way back to revolutionary times, I guess. And so why should it change? Well, a couple of things. And then he made it personal when someone kind of booed or something like that. He said something like, I can tell, I know one thing for sure, you don't have any kids. I don't want my kids going to a school with a bunch of traumatized kids who don't speak English. So let me break that into two things, the traumatized and the English. My father was brought up in a household where his parents spoke Yiddish. He learned English very quick. First of all, he was sent to the public schools. So there's an incentive to learn English. Now, if you want to make a criticism, and I don't know how this stands today, it used to be a big controversy, that bilingual education encourages the children of immigrants not to learn English, that's a great criticism. And lots of people, Sol and others, have made this, but that's not what Dave's talking about, of course. He's not saying the schools ought to be changed as long as we have public schools, changed to encourage them. I mean, there's a natural incentive to learn English in this country, right? I mean, if you really want to be successful, you're going to tend to learn English. So that's not the problem. Now let's go to the traumatized part. Today, I'm sure a lot of kids of, quote, illegal immigrants are traumatized. Look at the trip they have to take through the wilderness, over the war, through the water. They have to pay a coyote. The parents have paid them $15,000. But that would change with legalization. See, here's the problem. I put this on X. People like Smith on this issue attribute to immigration bad consequences of prohibition and black markets. They don't do that on drugs.
Nope.
If you say we can't have drugs, look at people shooting each other in the streets, the first thing Dave will say is that's the black market and prohibition. Well, I'm saying it, and that's what I wrote about in my second article called Static Analysis Clouds the Immigration Debate. Because, and he's not responded to that in any way. If they're traumatized, they wouldn't be traumatized if they could go to the consulate and just, I don't know, give information, give notice that they're coming to the United States, get a $400 airline ticket, and fly to Miami or whatever it is. I guarantee the kid's not going to be traumatized. Sure, it's a change of location, but that happens all the time with kids. They're not going to be traumatized. So, but why did he keep talking about, I don't want my kids in school with traumatized kids? Well, I don't want his kids to be in school with traumatized kids either. That's why I want to, legalize immigration, open the borders. So There was another sneaky thing he did. Alex had so much. I don't think Alex got to address that particular thing, but of course, Alex had a whole lot to do.
Now, so I got to ask a question, and I was, I was thinking, what question do I want to ask? And then I realized which one I wanted to ask it. So my question was that the two of you have spent time tonight debating what the federal government should be doing, but I haven't heard you guys discuss what they're actually authorized to do. And my question was, do you believe that the United States Constitution authorizes the federal government to restrict immigration in the manner, that you're talking about tonight? And if so, where can you find it? And Dave's answer was, he said, I'm here to talk about how libertarians should feel about the subject. I'm not a constitutionalist. There's some good things. There's some bad things in the Constitution. Right. Alex's answer was spot on. Alex pulled out his pocket Constitution. I have the same one in my basement from Cato. And he explained that, no, they're not authorized. He explained the history. But in the introduction to my comment, I actually said, Lysander Spooner notwithstanding, this is the law of the land.
Yeah.
What I found interesting about Dave's answer was, first of all, he spent a considerable amount of time talking about how we have to live in reality and accept what people want.
Yeah.
Well, I guarantee you, the vast majority of people in this country, you tell them, well, I don't really care about the Constitution. It's got some good things. It's got some bad things, but that's not really my thing. The majority of the people, for better or worse, want the Constitution. That's the first thing.
Okay, well, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I'll let you get to it. My second point is that if we're going to have a federal government, should it be, from a libertarian perspective, we should not want it behaving arbitrarily or assuming arbitrary powers, which it necessarily is if it's going against its charter. Now, I have my own criticism to the Constitution, and that's fine. But Dave dismissed it as if it's irrelevant to the issue. And I don't know how he thinks it's irrelevant to the issue. And now you can kill me on the Constitution if you want to.
I'm going to have to dissent a little, but that doesn't mean I'm going to take Dave's side. And I think you may know what I'm going to say, because I once sent you an article on this. That I have a small collection of essays on the Constitution that I wrote over the years, many of them when I was editor of the Freeman magazine.
Great magazine, by the way.
Thank you. Well, I didn't start it up. It doesn't exist anymore. I mean, everything's online. I don't think there's the Freeman, that title exists. But, James Madison, who of course wrote in the Federalist Papers that the Constitution is a document of few and defined powers. It creates a government of few and defined powers. It's very famous for that. But I think that's really misleading, because one of the chapters of my book, and people can find it online. They don't have to buy the book. Why don't I just say that? That's against my interest, isn't it? It's titled James Madison, author of the Implied Powers Doctrine. In other words, few and defined is the opposite of implied powers, right? The so-called liberals on the Supreme Court are tarred and feathered by conservatives for saying, well, no, it's not few and defined. But Madison, when they were debating what became the 10th Amendment, which is considered this, quote, states' rights amendment, right? It says something like, all power is not delegated to the federal government, the national government, are reserved to the states and or the people, something like that.
Yeah.
When that was being debated, and Madison was the mover of what became the Bill of Rights. Everyone else kind of lost interest in it, even though the anti-federalists were demanding a Bill of Rights. Once it got ratified, most everybody else said, "Okay, we don't need a Bill of Rights now. That's over with." Madison said, "No, as a matter of honor, I'm going to move this along." So when it came to debating what became the 10th, originally it was the 12th, but 2 others got knocked off. So it is the 10th. Thomas Tudor Tucker, representative from South Carolina, this is first in the committee, stood and offered an amendment. He wanted to put the word expressly before the word delegated. All powers not expressly delegated to the states, to the national government, are reserved to the states and the people. Madison stood up and objected and argued that no, every constitution has to have powers by implication, which would be ruled out by the word expressly. Now it went to the House as a whole, because Madison was in the House, was a member of the House at this time. It goes to the whole House, and again, Thomas Tudor Tucker offers his amendment to put the word expressly in there, and Madison again opposes it and ends it. Now, let me give you some evidence for why we have powers by implication. Now, you could say Madison's right or wrong. That's kind of not relevant at the moment. The point is he made the argument. He said otherwise there'd have to be an infinite list of powers if you couldn't have powers by implication. Think of eminent domain. Nobody questions. We question the propriety of it, but nobody questions that the government has the power of eminent domain. Find for me in the Constitution, not the Bill of Rights now, not the amendments, find for me in the Constitution under Article 1, Section 8 or Article 2, the power of eminent domain. It's not there. When we talk about the eminent domain, we talk about the Takings Clause in the Fifth Amendment.
Yeah.
Well, what if the amendments, and that didn't say, the Fifth Amendment does not say Congress shall have the power to take private property for public use with just compensation. No, it doesn't say that. It doesn't extend the power. It simply says, it assumes the power and says, when the government takes property,
that's a good point.
Pay fair compensation. So in other words, it was assumed power, because historically that was one of the power of states, right? To take property, maybe not a compensation, but to build roads, to build canals. That was considered, we disagree with it, that was considered one of the rights or powers of a state, assumed power. Well, I don't see why immigration control wouldn't have also been seen as it wasn't necessary to enumerate it, because it was just one of those natural power, not natural in our sense, but it went along with statehood, governmenthood.
Well, for one thing, there's contradictions in the Constitution, so you didn't dissent from me as much as I think.
But the eminent domain clause, the Taking Clause, doesn't contradict.
No, I don't. I'm not disagreeing with you. I think that the document is flawed. Yeah. I nevertheless believe that the people that adopted the Constitution, the subsequent arguments notwithstanding, in the Federalists, they argued the provisions being, the powers being few and defined. The 10th Amendment's pretty specific on it.
But not specific enough, because it didn't say expressly.
No, it's true. But at the time, the federal government wasn't involved in immigration. It wasn't involved for quite a long time after. Madison specifically argued against it. If you go to the Constitutional Convention debates and you look at what they were talking about in relation to the Naturalization Clause, for instance, it's clear.
But that was citizenship.
Yeah, it was. That's what I mean. Yeah.
As Sol said, there was an earlier time when, of course, these countries, the U.S. and other countries, wanted immigrants.
Yeah, well, that's the whole thing, is they wanted them at the time.
That helped to shape the whole thing.
But I do, however, think, regardless of what the position comes down to on the constitutional authority to control immigration, that the topic is certainly relevant to the debate that they were having. That if you're going to argue, for instance, Dave was citing the fact that Trump was elected. He was talking about taxes paid. All that's done under the umbrella of the United States Constitution. And then to say we're going to have a realistic discussion, but oh no, I don't care about the Constitution, just seemed a little bit like he couldn't answer the question. So he, used a maneuver, which he seemed to do a lot, that he
Well,
does
maybe
of
I should shut up
maneuvers.
then, because I helped him out by
You
giving my
you
argument.
did. You did. I think you're wrong, but nevertheless, that's one of the great things, Sheldon, is that respectful, honest people can disagree on things, and it doesn't turn into a food fight. Right? It doesn't have to, because you said earlier that you're listening to opposing views because you want to get to the truth and you want to grow. And when that's the case, you can honestly disagree with people and be fine, which brings me to my last question. I'm a big fan of debates. Some people aren't. What do you think? Do you think that debates serve a legitimate purpose, or is it just confirmation
Well, I don't think
bias?
it's yes. Well, I don't think it's yes or no. I'll start off by saying I generally don't like stage debates because so much of it is performance. And I don't think I've ever been in a formal debate. I mean, and Gene has invited me, but I said, I don't really like stage debates, because there can be a reward for glibness, a gotcha moment. What's the person supposed to do? Google something so I can answer your point. I mean,
Yeah.
so it's not my favorite format. It can certainly be entertaining. And depending on the two people who are debating, or sometimes it's four, it can overcome those problems. If you have the right kind of people who are, not looking for glibness or flashiness or Perry Mason moments or stuff like that. Yeah. So there's a spectrum. It can be good. I wouldn't want to see everybody just stop putting them on, because you do learn from them. And I learned something from this debate. Not that I heard an argument I hadn't heard before, but they were revealing just to see the two guys performing. But it's still kind of performance art. I don't know who the typical person is who comes to a debate, whether if he says undecided, is he really undecided? There's a funny, this reminds me of a funny story from when one of the campaign books written after the Jimmy Carter, Jerry Ford election reported that when they were supposed to debate, right? They did debate, but before the debate, this reporter was out on the street asking people, "Are you going to be watching the debate? You're going to watch the debate?" And one old woman said, "No, I'm not going to watch the debate." He said, "Why not?" She said, "I make up my own mind without outside influence." So she wasn't even. She didn't even want to be influenced by the candidates. So I hope Gene keeps putting them on forever.
I hope so too, because I hope to get on that stage one of these days.
Well, that would be interesting too, right? You and I can debate. I don't know what we can debate. Implied powers. I don't think we could take up an hour or so with that. But there's a tendency for there to be performance, but that's not going to be true of everyone. I mean, he's had very good people up there, and I'm not. I think Dave wants to sell his point of view too, so I don't think that was just performance. But he is a performer, like you said in the very beginning.
Yeah,
you can't take that. That's part of your personality.
Sure. Yeah, that's why I said I'm not knocking him for it.
Yeah, that's going to kind of shape your whole.
Yeah, it's impossible not to. All right, Sheldon. Hey, you took this interview on short notice, and I really, really appreciate it. It was great to talk to you as always, and keep interacting with me on X, and I'm sure I'll have you back on here again too. And your posts on Facebook too, I share them frequently. So where can people find you, Sheldon?
My weekly article on Fridays, TGIF, which doesn't stand for Thank Goodness It's Friday, but stands for The Goal is Freedom, is at the Libertarian Institute, so libertarianinstitute.org. And those articles, but other additional things, are at my own blog, which I've had for 20 years now. It's 20 years old, called Free Association. I think it's sheldonfreeassociation.blogspot.com. I think if you just Google it. I also have the same stuff on Substack, so you can find me one place or another.
Awesome. Thank you so much again. And for now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Till next time.